Seattle rain. 10,000 fans crying. One woman screaming at a ghost. April 8, 1994. The sky wept over Seattle Center as mourning fans gathered in the darkness, clutching candles and Nirvana albums like sacred relics. At the center of this makeshift shrine to Kurt Cobain stood a figure in torn black lace. Courtney Love, soon to become the most vilified woman in rock history. "I am not a woman," she had once declared. "I am a force of nature." Tonight, that force would collide with a grief so massive it would reshape the landscape of rock forever. With shaking hands, she unfolded a piece of paper, Kurt's suicide note, and began to read his final words to the crowd that blamed her for his death. Her voice cracked and raged as she reached the end. "I don't have the passion anymore, and so remember, it's better to burn out than to fade away." Then, in a moment that would cement her reputation forever, she screamed at the dead man she loved, "And you know what? This is fucked. I want you all to say asshole really loud." The crowd's response was mixed. Some shouted along. Others stood in stunned silence. But Courtney Love had just done what no grieving widow was supposed to do. She had refused to be silent, refused to be grateful, refused to disappear gracefully into the shadow of her husband's legend. In that moment, she became something unprecedented in rock history, a woman who dared to be angry about her own tragedy. But this wasn't just the tantrum of a grieving widow. This was the culmination of a life spent fighting for space in a world that had never wanted her. From her chaotic childhood to her rise as the leader of Whole, from her tumultuous marriage to Kurt to her battles with addiction and public perception, Courtney Love had always been exactly what she declared herself to be. Not a woman, but a force of nature. The question that would haunt her for decades was whether that force had been creative or destructive. Had she been Kurt's salvation or his destruction? Had she killed the golden boy of grunge? Or had she simply been the only person brave enough to love him without trying to save him? The world had already decided, but Courtney Love had never cared what the world thought. In the years that followed, she would be called every name imaginable: murderer, gold digger, attention seeker, unfit mother, talentless hanger-on. But she would also be nominated for Golden Globes, lead one of the most important feminist rock bands of the 1990s, and inspire a generation of women to claim their space in the male-dominated world of alternative music. To understand how a small-town girl from Oregon became the most polarizing figure in rock history, we must journey back to the beginning, to a childhood so chaotic it would make addiction seem like stability, to a young woman so desperate for love she would do anything to get it, and to an artist so uncompromising she would rather be hated than ignored. Because sometimes the most important stories are about the women history tried to silence, the ones who refused to be grateful for their tragedies, the ones who dared to be complicated in a world that preferred its female figures simple and sympathetic. The year was 1964, and America was on the brink of cultural revolution. In San Francisco, at the epicenter of the counterculture movement that would soon explode across the world, Linda Carroll gave birth to a daughter who would embody every contradiction of the era to come. Courtney Michelle Harrison entered the world as the unwanted child of a relationship already falling apart, born into a family that would scatter across continents before she learned to walk. Her father, Hank Harrison, was a minor figure in the early psychedelic music scene, a wannabe intellectual who wrote books about the Grateful Dead and believed he was witnessing the birth of a new consciousness. Her mother, Linda, was a therapist with her own untreated trauma, seeking healing through Eastern philosophy and geographic escape. Neither was prepared for the reality of raising a child, especially one as demanding and intense as Courtney would prove to be. The early years were marked by constant upheaval. Linda would pack up their meager belongings and move them from commune to commune, city to city, country to country, always searching for something: enlightenment, peace, a place where she could start over. Courtney's earliest memories were of unfamiliar faces, strange accents, and the constant anxiety of not knowing where she would sleep next or who would be taking care of her. By the age of 4, Courtney had lived in more places than most adults. Oregon communes where naked adults practiced free love while children fended for themselves, New Zealand sheep farms where she learned that survival required toughness, and finally sheep stations in Australia where the isolation was so complete that madness seemed like a reasonable response. But it was during a period living in a hippie commune in Oregon that Courtney learned the first and most devastating lesson about female existence. Women are not believed. At the age of 9, she was sexually abused by one of the adult men in the community, a violation that should have triggered protection and justice. Instead, when she finally found the courage to speak, she discovered the cruel mathematics of female testimony. Her word against his equaled silence. The commune's response was swift and merciless. They questioned her credibility, minimized her experience, and ultimately blamed her for misunderstanding adult behavior. Her mother, Linda, trapped in her own denial and New Age philosophy about forgiveness, chose to believe the community over her own daughter. In that moment, 9-year-old Courtney Love learned that being female meant being doubted, dismissed, and ultimately disposable. This betrayal created more than trauma. It forged a philosophy that would define her entire approach to power and voice. If women weren't believed when they whispered, perhaps they would be heard when they screamed. If feminine vulnerability invited abuse, perhaps feminine rage could demand respect. The seeds of the force of nature were planted in that moment of absolute abandonment by the adults meant to protect her. Could this early betrayal by the adults who were supposed to protect her have created the defensive rage that would define Courtney's adult relationships? Or was she simply born with the kind of intensity that made conventional family life impossible? The constant moving and lack of stability had already made Courtney an expert at reading people quickly, adapting to new situations and fighting for attention in environments where she was always the outsider. These skills would serve her well in the music industry, but they would also make authentic intimacy nearly impossible. By her early teens, Courtney had been shuttled between her unreliable mother and a series of foster families and boarding schools. She was already showing signs of the behavioral problems that would plague her throughout her life. Explosive anger, attention-seeking behavior, and a complete inability to accept authority. Schools complained that she was disruptive, uncontrollable, impossible to manage. At 14, she was sent to Hillcrest Reform School in Salem, Oregon, not for committing crimes, but simply because no one knew what else to do with her. The reform school was supposed to provide structure and discipline, but for Courtney, it was just another institution trying to break her spirit. She learned to survive through a combination of charm, manipulation, and explosive violence when pushed too far. It was at Hillcrest that Courtney first discovered the power of performance as a survival tool. She could make the other girls laugh with her impressions of the staff. She could manipulate the guards with flirtation or fake tears, and she could command attention through outrageous behavior that crossed every possible line. These weren't healthy coping mechanisms, but they worked. The other girls at Hillcrest were mostly from broken homes like her own, casualties of the Cultural Revolution that had promised to liberate children, but had often simply abandoned them. Among these damaged girls, Courtney found her first real peer group, other young women who had been discarded by the adult world and had learned to fend for themselves through whatever means necessary. But even among these hardened teenagers, Courtney stood out for her intelligence, her literary knowledge, and her consuming hunger for something more than the limited options society offered girls like them. While the other inmates talked about finding boyfriends who would take care of them, Courtney talked about becoming famous, about making art, about forcing the world to pay attention to her on her own terms. Was this early institutionalization a trauma that damaged her ability to form healthy relationships? Or was it the training ground that taught her the skills she would need to survive in the hostile environment of the music industry? At 16, Courtney managed to emancipate herself from the foster care system and began the nomadic period that would define her late teens and early 20s. With no family support and no real plan beyond escaping institutional control, she embarked on a journey that would take her across multiple continents and through experiences that would have destroyed someone with less determination. Her first stop was Tokyo, where she lived as a street musician and occasional sex worker, surviving on the margins of a society that had no place for foreign teenage runaways. The experience was harsh but educational. She learned to speak basic Japanese, to navigate complex social hierarchies, and to charm her way into situations that should have been far beyond her reach. From Japan, she made her way to Liverpool, England, drawn by the mythology of the Beatles and the promise of a music scene that might accept her. She spent months busking on street corners, sleeping in squats, and absorbing the working-class punk ethos that would later influence her musical style. The British punk scene of the early 1980s was brutal and unforgiving, but it was also one of the few places where a young woman with no connections could create her own identity through sheer force of personality. It was during this period that Courtney first began seriously pursuing music. Not just as a survival mechanism, but as a form of artistic expression. She learned to play guitar through a combination of formal lessons, when she could afford them, and informal mentoring from other musicians who were drawn to her raw charisma and obvious intelligence. But music wasn't her only interest. Courtney was consuming literature voraciously: Sylvia Plath, William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, finding in these writers a language for the chaos and alienation she felt. She began to see connections between the confessional poetry of Plath and the raw honesty of punk rock, between the experimental techniques of Burroughs and the feedback-drenched noise of underground music. She also developed a fascination with fame itself, not just the desire to be famous, but an analytical interest in how celebrity functioned, how public personas were constructed, and how talented people navigated the machinery of cultural production. This meta-awareness would later make her one of the most sophisticated manipulators of media attention in rock history. During this period, Courtney also began experimenting with the kind of provocative behavior that would later make her famous. She understood instinctively that in a crowded field of wannabe musicians and artists, the most valuable commodity was attention itself. She began developing the persona that would make her notorious, part intellectual, part sex symbol, part out-of-control wild child. By her early 20s, Courtney had returned to the United States with a wealth of experience that no formal education could have provided. She had survived as a teenage runaway in multiple countries, learned to navigate complex social hierarchies, and developed a sophisticated understanding of how power and attention functioned in different cultural contexts. She had also accumulated enough trauma and rage to fuel a lifetime of artistic expression. The abuse, abandonment, and institutionalization of her childhood had created wounds that would never fully heal, but they had also given her a perspective on female experience that was both universal and utterly unique. Was this peripatetic period of her youth a necessary education that prepared her for the challenges of the music industry? Or was it simply prolonged trauma that would make healthy relationships and emotional stability impossible? In 1985, Courtney arrived in Los Angeles with a guitar, a head full of literary references, and an absolute determination to make it in the music industry on her own terms. The LA scene of the mid-1980s was dominated by hair metal and manufactured glamour, but underground, a more authentic alternative was beginning to emerge, the seeds of what would eventually become the grunge movement. Courtney formed her first serious band, Sugar Baby Doll, which existed primarily as a vehicle for her growing musical ambitions and her need to be the center of attention. The band was critically ignored but locally notorious for Courtney's confrontational stage presence and her willingness to say anything to get a reaction from audiences and press. But Sugar Baby Doll was just practice for what would become her life's work. In 1989, Courtney formed Hole with guitarist Eric Erlandson, creating what would become one of the most important feminist rock bands of the 1990s. The name itself was typical Courtney, simultaneously sexual, violent, and metaphorically rich. It could refer to female anatomy, to emptiness, to the spaces between things, to wounds that wouldn't heal. From its inception, Hole was different from other bands emerging from the alternative scene. While groups like Nirvana and Soundgarden were primarily concerned with male alienation and working-class frustration, Hole focused specifically on female experience, sexual violence, body image, the Madonna whore complex, the struggle for agency in relationships dominated by male power. Courtney's lyrics were unlike anything being produced by her contemporaries. Songs like Teenage Whore and Baby Doll combined brutal honesty about female sexuality with literary sophistication and raw emotional power. She was writing from a perspective that had been largely absent from rock music, that of a woman who had experienced the worst that men could do but refused to be silenced by it. Her vocal style was equally revolutionary. Where female rock singers had traditionally been expected to choose between technical proficiency and raw emotion, Courtney refused the choice entirely. Her voice could shift from sweet melody to guttural scream within the same line, embodying the contradictions of female experience in a way that was both beautiful and disturbing. The band's early performances were legendary for their intensity and unpredictability. Courtney would appear on stage in torn baby doll dresses, her makeup smeared, her hair wild, looking like a deranged doll that had come to life. She would scream, whisper, seduce, and threaten audiences, often within the span of a single song. But the performances weren't just theatrical spectacle. They were radical political statements about female rage and the right of women to be ugly, angry, and demanding in public spaces. Courtney was claiming territory that had been exclusively male, insisting that women had the right to be as messy, complicated, and unpalatable as their male counterparts. The music industry didn't know what to do with Hole. They were too feminist for mainstream rock, too aggressive for alternative radio, and too confrontational for the emerging riot girl movement, which preferred its politics more clearly articulated and its anger more controlled. But audiences, particularly young women, responded to Hole's music with the kind of passionate devotion usually reserved for religious movements. For the first time, many of these women were hearing their own experiences reflected in rock music, the experiences of sexual assault, eating disorders, dysfunctional relationships, and the daily indignities of existing as a female body in a hostile world. Was Courtney's creation of Hole an artistic breakthrough that gave voice to previously silenced female experiences? Or was it simply the channeling of personal trauma into a form that happened to resonate with other damaged women? The early 1990s brought both professional success and personal chaos for Courtney Love. Hole's debut album, Pretty on the Inside, received critical acclaim for its raw power and unflinching examination of female pain, but it also cemented Courtney's reputation as someone who was impossible to work with, demanding, unstable, and prone to explosive conflicts with anyone who tried to control her artistic vision. During this period, Courtney also began exploring acting, driven by the same need for attention and creative expression that had led her to music. Her early film appearances were small but memorable, usually playing versions of the damaged, provocative persona she had cultivated in real life. She was developing a multimedia approach to celebrity that was ahead of its time, using different artistic platforms to create a complex public image that was part performance, part genuine self-expression. But it was her personal life that would soon overshadow everything else. In late 1991, at a club in Los Angeles, two gravitational forces collided. Courtney met Kurt Cobain, and the grunge world's greatest love story and tragedy began. They were the Romeo and Juliet of alternative rock, if Shakespeare had written about heroin addiction and media persecution. Kurt Cobain, the golden boy, the reluctant prophet, the introvert who had accidentally become the voice of a generation. Beautiful in his brokenness, he carried his pain like a crown of thorns, singing his depression into anthems that moved millions. He was the angel who wanted to disappear. Courtney Love, the chaos goddess, the extrovert who demanded to be heard, the woman who wore her damage like armor. She had fought for every scrap of attention, every moment in the spotlight, every chance to prove that female rage could be art. She was the force that refused to be contained. The attraction was immediate and inevitable. Two people who recognized in each other the same beautiful destruction, the same artistic brilliance born from trauma. But their love was a feedback loop of mutual annihilation, each triggering the other's worst impulses while inspiring their greatest art. Kurt saw in Courtney someone who wouldn't try to save him. Courtney saw in Kurt someone who understood that salvation and destruction were often the same thing. Their courtship was conducted largely in public through interviews and song lyrics, creating a media narrative about their relationship before they had fully figured out what that relationship actually was. Kurt was at the height of his fame following the success of Nevermind, while Courtney was still fighting for recognition as an artist in her own right rather than simply someone's girlfriend. The dynamic was complicated from the beginning. Kurt was attracted to Courtney's strength, her intelligence, and her complete lack of awe at his celebrity status. She was one of the few people in his life who wasn't trying to manage him, fix him, or profit from his success. But he was also troubled by her chaotic energy, her need for attention, and her inability to moderate her behavior for the sake of social harmony. For Courtney, Kurt represented both artistic validation and emotional danger. He was proof that her musical instincts were correct. If the most acclaimed musician of their generation took her seriously as an artist, then she must have real talent. But he was also struggling with the same demons of addiction and depression that she was fighting, making their relationship a potentially destructive feedback loop of mutual enabling. Their marriage in February 1992 was both a romantic gesture and a practical alliance between two people who understood the pressures of fame and addiction in ways that no one else could. But it was also the moment when Courtney became permanently entangled with someone whose legend would eventually eclipse everything else about her identity. The media coverage of their relationship was savage from the beginning. Rock journalism in the early 1990s was still dominated by men who had specific ideas about how women should behave in relation to male rock stars. Courtney violated every rule. She was louder than Kurt, more willing to engage with the press, and completely unwilling to play the supportive wife role that the media expected. The most damaging article came from Vanity Fair writer Lynn Hirschberg, who alleged that Courtney had used heroin while pregnant with Frances Bean. The article, published just months before Frances's birth, created a scandal that would follow Courtney for the rest of her life and lead to government intervention in her family's private life. Was the media treatment of Courtney's relationship with Kurt evidence of systematic sexism in rock journalism? Or was she genuinely creating problems through her inability to control her public behavior? The truth, as always with Courtney Love, was probably both. The period from 1992 to 1994 represented both the peak of Courtney's artistic achievement and the beginning of her transformation into a tragic public figure. Hole's second album, Live Through This, was completed just days before Kurt's death and would eventually be recognized as one of the greatest rock albums of the decade. A raw, powerful exploration of female rage that channeled Courtney's personal Kate into transcendent art. But the album's creation was overshadowed by the deteriorating state of her marriage to Kurt. Both were struggling with heroin addiction, the pressures of fame, and their own psychological demons. Their relationship had become a public spectacle, with every fight, reconciliation, and relapse documented by tabloid photographers and gossip columnists. Kurt's addiction was getting worse, and his depression was deepening despite the professional success that should have provided stability and satisfaction. Courtney was fighting her own battles with addiction while trying to care for their infant daughter and maintain her own career. The pressure was enormous, and both were showing signs of cracking under the weight of public expectation and private pain. During this period, Courtney also had to navigate the complex politics of being a successful woman in the male-dominated alternative rock scene. While Kurt was praised for his authenticity and artistic integrity, Courtney was frequently dismissed as a fame-seeking opportunist who was riding her husband's coattails to success she didn't deserve. The irony was that Hole's music was often more innovative and emotionally powerful than Nirvana's, but Courtney would never receive the critical recognition that Kurt enjoyed. The rock establishment had made space for one tragic, drug-addicted genius, and that space was reserved for men. The accusations that would later surround Kurt's death began during this period, as friends and observers noted the volatile nature of their relationship and Courtney's history of explosive, sometimes violent behavior. Some suggested that she was bad for Kurt's mental health, that her chaos was exacerbating his already fragile psychological state. But others, particularly those who knew them both well, saw a different dynamic. Two people who were trying to save each other from demons that couldn't be conquered through love alone. Courtney wasn't Kurt's destroyer. She was the only person in his life who understood the depth of his pain, because she shared it. The final months of Kurt's life were marked by multiple suicide attempts, failed interventions, and growing concern from friends and family about his mental state. Courtney was fighting her own battle with addiction while trying to care for Francis and manage Kurt's increasingly erratic behavior. On April 5, 1994, Kurt Cobain was found dead in a room above the garage of their Seattle home, killed by a self-inflicted shotgun wound to the head. The note he left behind blamed his loss of passion for music and his inability to continue living as a performing artist. But it said nothing about Courtney or their relationship. Did this tragic event mark the end of a marriage that was doomed from the beginning? Or was it the moment when Courtney Love became the most hated woman in rock, blamed for a tragedy she was powerless to prevent? The death of Kurt Cobain on April 5, 1994, transformed Courtney Love from controversial rock star into the defendant in the world's largest kangaroo court. Within hours of the body's discovery, the trial of public opinion began, and Courtney Love was guilty until proven innocent, except no evidence would ever be enough to prove her innocence. The courtroom was everywhere. Radio call-in shows, internet forums, magazine covers, coffee shop conversations. The jury was every Nirvana fan who needed someone to blame for their idol's death. The prosecution was led by conspiracy theorists, private investigator Tom Grant, and a media machine hungry for a villain more compelling than mental illness and addiction. The charges were murder, manipulation, and the ultimate crime against rock mythology. Destroying a beautiful broken boy who represented the pure soul of grunge. The evidence? None. But in the court of public opinion, Courtney's greatest crime was being exactly who she had always been: loud, difficult, uncontainable, and female. When John Lennon was murdered, the world embraced Yoko Ono as a grieving widow deserving sympathy. When Kurt Cobain killed himself, Courtney Love was branded as his destroyer. The difference wasn't their behavior. Yoko had been equally controversial, equally blamed for breaking up the Beatles. The difference was that Yoko was allowed to grieve with dignity, while Courtney was sentenced to be forever guilty of loving someone who chose death over life. For Courtney, the accusations were devastating on multiple levels. She had lost the man she loved, the father of her daughter, and her closest artistic collaborator. But instead of receiving sympathy or support, she found herself the target of a hatred so intense. It felt like a form of persecution. She was simultaneously grieving and defending herself against accusations of murder. The media's treatment of her during this period revealed the deeply misogynistic assumptions that still governed how society processed female behavior. When John Lennon was murdered, Yoko Ono received sympathy as his widow. When Kurt Cobain killed himself, Courtney Love was blamed for his death. The difference wasn't their behavior, It was their gender and the culture's need to find a female scapegoat for male self-destruction. The public memorial service 4 days after Kurt's death became the moment when Courtney's reputation was permanently cemented. Her decision to read Kurt's suicide note to the gathered crowd was seen by many as inappropriate, attention-seeking, and disrespectful to his memory. Her anger at him for abandoning her and Frances was interpreted as evidence of her selfishness rather than natural human response to abandonment. But the reading of the note also revealed something crucial about Courtney's character. Her complete inability to perform grief in the way society expected. She refused to be the silent, dignified widow. She refused to pretend that suicide was noble or romantic. She was angry at Kurt for choosing death over life with his family, and she wasn't going to hide that anger to make other people more comfortable. The crowd's reaction was mixed, but the media's response was uniformly negative. Headlines focused on her inappropriate behavior rather than the substance of her grief or the legitimate questions she was raising about the romanticization of suicide in rock culture. In the months that followed, Courtney found herself fighting a war on multiple fronts. She was battling her own addiction while trying to care for Frances, completing the final touches on Live Through This while dealing with record company executives who weren't sure how to market an album by the widow of a suicide victim, and defending herself against increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories about her role in Kurt's death. The release of Live Through This just 4 days after Kurt's death created another layer of controversy. Some critics praised the album as a powerful statement of grief and survival, while others suggested that Kurt had written much of the material and Courtney was taking credit for his posthumous work. The accusation was particularly galling because it dismissed not only her talent, but her right to artistic autonomy. The album's success, it would eventually go platinum and spawn several hit singles, should have established Courtney as a major artist in her own right. Instead, it became another source of conspiracy theories, with some claiming that the timing of its release proved she had planned Kurt's death to promote her own career. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of such accusations? For Courtney, the conspiracy theories weren't just attacks on her reputation. They were attempts to erase her identity as an artist and reduce her to nothing more than a killer or manipulator. The legal battles began almost immediately. Courtney found herself fighting for control of Kurt's estate, for custody of Frances, and for her own freedom as various law enforcement agencies investigated the conspiracy theories surrounding his death. She was subjected to drug tests, psychological evaluations, and constant surveillance by Child Protective Services. The stress of these battles, combined with her own grief and addiction, created a downward spiral that played out in public. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, her public statements more confrontational, and her appearance more disheveled. The media documented every stumble, every outburst, every sign of instability as evidence that she was exactly the monster they had painted her to be. But buried beneath the chaos and controversy was a woman who was trying to survive an impossible situation. She had become one of the most famous people in the world not through her own achievements, but through her association with tragedy. Every day brought new attacks on her character, new threats to her custody of Frances, and new reminders that much of the world saw her as a villain rather than a victim. The period following Kurt Cobain's death marked the beginning of Courtney Love's transformation from musician to multimedia celebrity, as she channeled her rage and grief into an acting career that would surprise critics and further complicate her public image. Her decision to pursue film roles wasn't just artistic ambition. It was survival strategy, an attempt to create an identity separate from her role as Kurt's widow and the target of conspiracy theories. Her breakthrough came with Milos Forman's The People vs. Larry Flynt, where she played Althea Leisure, the drug-addicted wife of Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flynt. The role was revelatory. Here was proof that Courtney Love could have been more than a tragic footnote to someone else's legend. Her performance was raw, honest, and completely convincing, earning Golden Globe and Screen Actors Guild nominations. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible that Courtney could transcend the stigma of being Kurt's widow and establish herself as a serious actress. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive, with many reviewers expressing genuine surprise at her talent. She had taken her real-life experience with addiction and exploitation and transformed it into art that moved audiences without exploiting her own tragedy. But even this triumph carried the seeds of its own limitation. Hollywood, like the music industry, couldn't see past her notoriety. While male actors with histories of addiction and erratic behavior were celebrated as authentic and dangerous, Courtney was seen as too risky, too unpredictable, too likely to overshadow the film with her personal drama. She could have won an Oscar, but she would always be Courtney Love first and an actress second. But even this professional triumph was overshadowed by continued speculation about her past. Instead of celebrating her acting ability, much of the media coverage focused on how her real-life experiences with addiction and abusive relationships had prepared her for the role. She couldn't escape being seen as someone who was simply playing versions of herself rather than demonstrating actual acting talent. The success of The People vs. Larry Flynt should have opened doors to more substantial film roles. But Hollywood's treatment of Courtney revealed the same double standards she had faced in the music industry. While male actors with histories of drug addiction and erratic behavior were celebrated as bad boys whose personal demons fueled their artistic authenticity, Courtney was seen as too unpredictable and potentially damaging to major productions. During this period, she also continued working with Hole, but the band's dynamic had shifted significantly after Kurt's death. The other members were struggling with their own grief and trauma, and Courtney's increasing focus on her acting career created tensions about the band's future direction and priorities. The late 1990s saw Courtney attempting to reinvent herself as a more mainstream celebrity, appearing at awards shows in designer gowns instead of torn baby doll dresses, giving interviews where she tried to present a more polished version of herself. But these efforts often backfired, as audiences and critics seemed to prefer her when she was out of control and destructive. The public's relationship with Courtney Love was fundamentally masochistic. They were most interested in her when she was destroying herself, and they became bored or suspicious when she showed signs of stability or professional growth. She was trapped in a persona that had brought her fame but made genuine evolution nearly impossible. Her romantic relationships during this period were all conducted under intense media scrutiny, with each new boyfriend subjected to speculation about his motivations and Courtney's fitness as a partner. The assumption seemed to be that any man involved with her was either taking advantage of her or enabling her self-destructive tendencies. Were these efforts at reinvention genuine attempts at personal growth? Or were they calculated moves by someone who understood that her original persona had become commercially and personally unsustainable? With Courtney Love, the line between authentic transformation and performance had always been blurry. The pressure of maintaining her public profile while trying to be a responsible mother to Francis created another layer of complexity in her life. She was determined to provide Francis with the stability she had never experienced as a child. But her own psychological wounds and the constant media attention made normal parenting nearly impossible. Child Protective Services remained involved in their lives for years after Kurt's death, monitoring Courtney's behavior and intervening whenever her addiction or erratic behavior created concerns about Francis's welfare. The threat of losing her daughter became another source of anxiety and motivation for Courtney to try to maintain some semblance of stability. The new millennium brought both new opportunities and familiar challenges for Courtney Love, as she continued her attempt to balance artistic ambition with personal stability while navigating an entertainment industry that seemed determined to keep her in the role of cautionary tale rather than legitimate artist. Hole's final album, Celebrity Skin, represented Courtney's most polished and commercially accessible work. but it also marked the beginning of the end for the band that had defined her artistic identity. The album's glossy production and radio-friendly hooks were a departure from the raw feminism of their earlier work, leading some critics to accuse Courtney of selling out her artistic integrity for mainstream success. The tensions within the band became increasingly public, with original guitarist Eric Erlandson and Courtney engaging in bitter disputes about songwriting credits, artistic direction, and money. The partnership that had created some of the most important feminist rock music of the 1990s was dissolving in a series of lawsuits and public accusations. But Courtney's most significant battle during this period was with her own addiction, which had escalated to life-threatening levels. Her struggles with prescription drugs, particularly OxyContin, became tabloid fodder as she was arrested multiple times for drug possession and erratic behavior. Each incident was documented in excruciating detail, turning her personal health crisis into public entertainment. The media's coverage of her addiction revealed the same double standards that had governed their treatment of her throughout her career. While male rock stars' drug problems were often portrayed as romantic or artistic, Courtney's addiction was presented as evidence of her fundamental character flaws and unfitness as a mother. Her multiple stints in rehab became public spectacles, with paparazzi camping outside treatment facilities and tabloids offering large sums for inside information about her progress. The idea that someone struggling with addiction might deserve privacy or compassion seemed not to apply to Courtney Love. During her periods of sobriety, Courtney would often speak eloquently about the relationship between trauma, addiction, and creativity, offering insights that could have been valuable to other people struggling with similar issues. But these moments of clarity were overshadowed by the drama of her relapses and the media's preference for stories about chaos rather than recovery. Her relationship with Francis became increasingly strained as her daughter grew older and more aware of the media attention surrounding their family. Francis began expressing desire for privacy and normalcy that was nearly impossible to achieve given her parents' legacies and her mother's continued notoriety. The custody battles that had begun after Kurt's death continued throughout Francis's childhood, with various family members and concerned friends periodically challenging Courtney's fitness as a parent. Each legal proceeding was covered extensively by entertainment media, turning Francis's childhood into a public custody case. Despite these challenges, Courtney remained fiercely protective of Francis and determined to provide her with opportunities and stability. She enrolled her in private schools, hired tutors and security guards, and tried to shield her from the worst aspects of celebrity culture while still maintaining her own career. Can anyone ever truly escape from the patterns established in their youth? For Courtney, the chaos of her own childhood seemed to be perpetually threatening to repeat itself in Francis's life, despite her best efforts to break the cycle. Her attempts to maintain relevance in an evolving music industry led to increasingly desperate behavior and public outbursts. The alternative rock scene that had made her famous was being replaced by new genres and younger artists, and Courtney struggled to find her place in this changing landscape. Her public feuds with other celebrities, Madonna, Dave Grohl, various music journalists, became a regular source of entertainment for gossip websites, but they also revealed someone who was struggling to process years of accumulated trauma and anger in healthy ways. In recent years, Courtney Love has become something more than a cultural artifact. She has revealed herself as the prototype of the modern female rock star. Look at today's most powerful women in alternative music. Billie Eilish's willingness to be strange and unpalatable. St. Vincent's combination of intellectual sophistication and visceral performance. Phoebe Bridgers' refusal to soften her emotional edges. Hayley Williams' evolution from pop-punk princess to complex artist exploring trauma and identity. Each of these women carries DNA from Courtney Love's revolution. The understanding that female artists don't have to choose between intelligence and rawness, between vulnerability and power, between being taken seriously and being authentically messy. Courtney proved that a woman could be brilliant and chaotic, talented and destructive, worthy of respect and impossible to control. The #MeToo movement has led to some reconsideration of Courtney's early allegations about powerful men in the entertainment industry. Her 2005 warning about Harvey Weinstein, delivered at a Comedy Central roast when such accusations could end careers, now reads as prophetic rather than attention-seeking. She was protecting other women before it was safe or profitable to do so, using her platform to speak truth to power when the cost was enormous. But this partial rehabilitation comes with its own limitations. As society has developed more sophisticated understanding of trauma and gender dynamics, there's a risk of reducing Courtney to another victim story rather than recognizing her as a revolutionary force who changed what was possible for women in rock music. But this partial rehabilitation has come at a cost. As society has developed more sophisticated understanding of trauma, addiction, and gender dynamics, Courtney's behavior has increasingly been seen through the lens of victimhood rather than agency. While this perspective is more compassionate than the vilification she experienced in the 1990s, it also threatens to reduce her to another sad story rather than recognizing her as a complex artist who made significant contributions to music and culture. Her relationship with Frances has improved as her daughter has become an adult and gained perspective on the unique challenges of their family situation. Frances has spoken publicly about her appreciation for her mother's strength and her understanding of the impossible position Courtney was placed in following Kurt's death. The estate disputes that dominated the early years after Kurt's death have largely been resolved, with Frances gaining control of her father's artistic legacy and Courtney retaining rights to certain aspects of his work. But the financial battles took their toll on both women, creating stress and publicity that affected their relationship for years. Courtney's current life is quieter than her peak notoriety years, but she remains one of the most recognizable figures in rock history. Her influence can be seen in contemporary artists who combine feminism with punk aggression, who refuse to moderate their personalities for mainstream acceptance, and who use their platforms to address uncomfortable truths about gender and power. The streaming era has introduced her music to new audiences who encounter it without the context of 1990s gossip and conspiracy theories. For these listeners, Hole's catalog stands on its own merits as powerful, innovative rock music that addressed female experience with unprecedented honesty and rage. What hidden truths about fame, trauma, and survival does Courtney Love's story continue to reveal? Her life illustrates the impossible position of women who dare to be complicated in public, who refuse to perform grief or trauma in socially acceptable ways, and who insist on their right to artistic expression even when that expression makes others uncomfortable. Courtney Love never became the woman the world wanted her to be. She never performed widowhood gracefully, never managed her addiction quietly, never channeled her rage into more palatable forms. But in refusing to be what others expected, she became something more valuable, a testament to the possibility of survival, a reminder that women can be messy and talented and worthy of consideration simultaneously. The girl who was born into chaos and raised by institutions became a woman who created her own institutions. Bands, albums, performances, and public statements that expanded the possibilities for female expression in rock music. She proved that women could be as angry, destructive, and uncompromising as men while still creating art that mattered. Her story serves as both cautionary tale and inspiration, proof that the price of authentic female expression in a patriarchal culture is enormous, but also evidence that paying that price can create space for others to follow. In choosing to be hated rather than ignored, Courtney Love ensured that her voice would never be silenced entirely. The most hated woman in rock never asked for love. She demanded attention, respect, and the right to exist on her own terms, in a world that preferred its female figures simple and sympathetic. She chose to be complicated and unforgivable. And in making that choice, she became unforgettable. Perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps being remembered as a force of nature was worth more than being loved as a conventional woman. Perhaps the girl who learned to survive through chaos and performance knew exactly what she was doing when she chose notoriety over respectability, complexity over likability, truth over comfort. Courtney Love didn't just survive her tragedies. She transformed them into art, attitude, and influence that continues to reverberate through rock culture decades later. She proved that sometimes the most important stories are the ones told by the women everyone tried to censor, the ones who refused to disappear gracefully, the ones who dared to be exactly what they declared themselves to be. Not women, but forces of nature.